They say a throne is not only built on power, but on blood. Yet what happens when that blood grows sick, when the lifeblood of a dynasty turns against itself? Imagine a family so obsessed with keeping their grip on power that they locked their doors to the outside world and married only among themselves. The result was not strength, it was weakness, centuries of decline written on the faces of kings and queens, in the twisted shapes of their bodies, in the broken minds that ruled nations. This is not a tale of victory, but of a slow decay, a dynasty crumbling under the very blood it worshipped. And yet, for centuries, they still sat upon the most glittering thrones of Europe. It is one of the darkest lessons in human history, that power without limits breeds madness, and isolation creates monsters. You can see it in their portraits, the strange and unsettling features, jutting jaws, hollow eyes, bodies frail and fragile, but weighed down with crowns too heavy to bear. These were not ordinary families. They were empires in miniature, collapsing in on themselves, and while their palaces gleamed with gold and marble, behind the closed doors of their bedchambers, something far more disturbing was taking place. This is the story of the most inbred dynasty ever recorded. A family whose name once commanded armies, dictated laws, and stretched influence across continents. But their real legacy is not their power. It is the haunting reminder of what happens when human beings defy nature itself in pursuit of control. The story is both grotesque and tragic, for within it lies the suffering of children born into a prison of blood, of rulers made fragile by their very lineage, and of nations destabilized by the frailty of their kings. Every monarchy has secrets, but this one has something darker, something that history tried to bury in silence. It is not just a chronicle of kings and queens. It is a cautionary tale carved into bone and flesh, etched into the faces of rulers who could barely rule themselves. Tonight, we open the vault of history and look directly into the shadows they left behind. What you will hear is not myth. It is truth, and it is far more disturbing than legend. They called themselves chosen by God, anointed to rule above all others. But the dynasty's true foundation was not divine blessing. It was calculation, a desperate clinging to bloodlines that grew narrower with each passing generation. The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful ruling families in European history, bound themselves together through cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, even uncle to grandniece. Their ambition was eternal dominion, but the cost was corruption at the most intimate level, the corruption of their very flesh. For centuries they sat on the thrones of Spain, Austria, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire. Their banners flew over empires that shaped the world. Yet behind the grandeur of castles and cathedrals, their private lives resembled a closed circle, suffocating in its own obsession, a web of marriages so tangled that it could not sustain life without deforming it. The family tree did not branch outward, it folded in on itself, each generation collapsing closer and closer to ruin. It is a chilling paradox. The Habsburgs controlled the destiny of millions, yet could not protect their own children from the very strategy that secured their thrones. They prized blood purity above all else, but what they created was blood weakness. And the portraits of their kings tell a silent story that no court chronicler dared to speak. Jaws grown unnaturally long, lips so swollen they could barely close, tongues so large they struggled to form words. The infamous Habsburg jaw was not a mark of nobility, it was a scar left by centuries of choices made in candlelit chambers, where love was irrelevant and lineage was everything. This obsession reached its most horrifying expression in the Spanish line of the family. Generations of intermarriage twisted their dynasty into something fragile, unstable, grotesque. The blood that was supposed to give them supremacy left them instead with madness, sterility, and early death. Every marriage was a gamble and every child a living reminder of the dynasty's decline, yet still, the cycle continued. The throne was worth more than the health of their children. The crown was heavier than compassion. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving power, but in truth they were erasing themselves. Their story is not merely about kings and queens, It is about what happens when human ambition dares to rewrite nature. And as we move deeper into their history, the names and faces become more haunting, until the final heir of this bloodline, a young king, was born into a body already condemned by the choices of those who came before him. The culmination of this dynasty's obsession was a boy born in Madrid in 1661. His name was Charles II of Spain, but history remembers him by another title, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was the last of his line, and in his body lay the full inheritance of centuries of inbreeding. His birth was not a beginning but an ending, the fragile ember of a flame that had burned too long. From the moment he entered the world, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Charles was small, frail, and sickly, unable to speak until the age of 4, unable to walk until he was nearly 8. His skull grew abnormally large, his tongue so swollen that he could scarcely chew or articulate words. He drooled constantly, his speech garbled and slow. His jaw jutted forward in that infamous Habsburg deformity, so severe that he could not close his mouth completely. Eating was an ordeal. Breathing was labored. He was, in truth, a prisoner inside his own body. But beyond the physical, there was something more tragic. Charles's mind was clouded, his intelligence stunted by the same twisted inheritance. As king, he could not govern, and so Spain was ruled not by Charles but by factions, courtiers, and foreign powers who manipulated him like a marionette. His throne, once the seat of vast imperial power, became a hollow chair beneath a broken boy. The court whispered endlessly. Some believed he was cursed, that witchcraft had stolen his vitality. They sought exorcisms, charms, holy relics to heal him, as if his condition were the work of demons. But the truth was far simpler and far darker. Charles was not bewitched. He was bred. His suffering was the inevitable outcome of generations who chose crowns over children, bloodlines over life itself. By the time Charles reached adulthood, Spain was collapsing around him. The empire that had conquered half the known world now teetered on the edge of ruin, ruled by a man who could barely feed himself without assistance. His body was racked with disease, his fertility destroyed. He was married twice but produced no heirs. And with his death in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, not with a triumph but with a whimper, a haunting silence that spoke louder than any royal decree. Charles II stands as the most tragic figure of this dynasty, a king crowned in splendor, but condemned to live as a breathing monument to his family's choices. His life was not his own. It was the final chapter of a story written long before he was born. When Charles II died childless, it was not merely the end of a man, it was the collapse of a dynasty that had once commanded half the world. His death marked the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line, and with it came chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, dragging Europe into one of its bloodiest conflicts, all because a family had destroyed itself from within. What centuries of enemies could not achieve, their own blood had undone. Yet the tragedy of the Habsburgs is not confined to Spain. The Austrian branch of the family carried on, still weaving marriages among cousins, still clinging to the belief that their blood was sacred. The deformities were less dramatic than in Charles, but the shadow of weakness remained. Mental instability, fragile health, infertility, these were their inheritance. Even as their empire endured, their rulers bore the quiet scars of the same obsession. And still, they believed themselves untouchable. They wrapped their sickness in the language of destiny, calling it divine will. But history reveals a darker truth. They were prisoners of their own myth, shackled to a throne built on decay. For centuries they wore their crowns as if nothing were wrong, as if the portraits hanging in their palaces did not reveal jaws too long, eyes too sunken, mouths frozen in unnatural shapes. Artists painted them with reverence, but the deformities could not be erased. The faces themselves betrayed the cost of their pride. The people saw it, even if the court denied it. Whispers spread through villages and marketplaces, mocking songs, cruel rhymes about the royal jaw, the strange gait, the vacant stares of their kings. Power could not hide weakness forever. and beneath the gold and marble, the dynasty's body was rotting, one birth at a time. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not the physical deformities, but the human suffering. Within those royal walls, children born into lives of privilege, yet condemned from birth to frailty and despair. Women forced into unions with their uncles, cousins, and nephews, their wombs becoming battlefields for dynastic survival. Men groomed from childhood to take crowns they could not carry. These were not simply monarchs, they were victims of a system that prized control above compassion, tradition above nature, blood above humanity. The world remembers their titles, their wars, their wealth, but the true legacy of the Habsburgs is written in silence, in bones deformed, in blood corrupted, in dynasties extinguished, not by the sword, but by themselves. What makes this story so haunting is not just the ruin of a family, but the lesson it whispers across centuries. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving their power. In truth, they were sowing their destruction. Their castles, their armies, their riches, all of it was nothing compared to the simple truth of nature. And nature will not be cheated. When the tree does not branch, it breaks. The tragedy is amplified when you realize how human it all was. Behind the marble halls and golden crowns, these were families making choices. Choices to marry a cousin instead of a stranger, a niece instead of a noble from another land. Every decision was cloaked in duty, every sacrifice justified by the preservation of the throne, and yet each choice tightened the noose. Each generation drew the bloodline closer to collapse. Look at Charles II once more, the final heir of Spain. His entire genome has been studied by modern historians and geneticists, revealing something chilling. He was more inbred than the child of two siblings. Imagine carrying in your veins the weight of centuries, the narrowing of blood so extreme it could not sustain life. His body was a ledger, his veins the ink, each deformity a tally mark in a debt long overdue. And what of the empire he ruled? Spain, once the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, descended into weakness under his reign. A single man, too fragile to lead, became the undoing of millions. It is a sobering reminder that power, concentrated in too few hands, can poison not only a family, but an entire nation. This is where the story begins to move beyond history and into warning, because while the Habsburgs may be gone, the pattern they represent is eternal. Families, corporations, governments, even nations can fall into the same trap. The obsession with control, the fear of dilution, the refusal to change. Their decline is a mirror, held up to all who believe themselves untouchable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you break the chain, risk the throne to save your children, or would you obey tradition, knowing the price it demanded? The Habsburgs did not ask those questions, and because of that, their empire rotted from within. Centuries later, their portraits still hang in museums, silent witnesses to their own undoing. Visitors walk past without knowing the full truth, admiring the gilded frames and royal robes, rarely noticing the details that tell the darker story. The swollen lips, the elongated jaws, the glassy, distant eyes of rulers who could scarcely function as men, yet bore the weight of nations. These paintings are not celebrations of power, they are tombstones carved in oil and canvas. And yet the Habsburgs were not unique, they were only the most extreme, the most visible, the most recorded. History is littered with dynasties who collapsed for the same reason: bloodlines too tight, ambition too blind, traditions too sacred to break. From ancient Egypt to medieval Britain, the cycle repeats. Families who believed they were chosen, who thought themselves untouchable, who withered because they refused to let new blood in. The Habsburgs simply left the most grotesque monument. What chills us even now is how preventable it all was. One marriage to an outsider could have changed everything. One act of defiance against tradition might have spared children like Charles II a lifetime of suffering. But no one dared. The fear of losing power was greater than the fear of losing humanity. And so the dynasty marched forward, blinded by its own pride, dragging its children into a future already doomed. There is something almost biblical in the fall of the Habsburgs, as if they were punished not by their enemies, but by their own hands. Their faith told them they were chosen by God, but their bodies revealed the opposite. They were fragile, mortal, breakable. Their belief in divine right was shattered by the cruel reality of biology. They became the living embodiment of a warning that no empire, no matter how vast, can escape the laws of nature. And in the end, their power dissolved into dust. Thrones were lost, crowns passed into the hands of strangers, and the family that once stretched across continents became a cautionary tale whispered in history books. The Habsburg name survives, but its might is gone. What remains is not empire. It is memory. A memory etched in bone, preserved in portraiture, and whispered in the stories of historians who dare to look closer. The dynasty dreamed of eternity. What it left was a ghost. The story of the Habsburgs lingers because it is not just history, it is a mirror. A dynasty that once seemed immortal revealed how fragile power truly is when it is built on arrogance and fear. They remind us that wealth, armies, and crowns mean nothing when the blood that carries them forward is poisoned by the very choices meant to preserve it. Their castles still stand, their portraits still watch us with hollow eyes, but their true legacy is silence. The silence of a bloodline that devoured itself. We look at them now with a mixture of fascination and horror. The Habsburg jaw has become infamous, a grotesque symbol of inbreeding, but the real tragedy runs deeper than bone and face. It is the lives of children who never had a chance, women trapped in marriages that chained them to their own kin, men broken under the weight of crowns they could not carry. Every one of them was both royalty and prisoner, both ruler and victim. Their story is not just about deformity, it is about suffering, the kind no gold or power could erase. And perhaps that is why their tale still resonates. Because it is more than a lesson in genetics, more than a warning about dynastic pride. It is a human tragedy that repeats itself wherever ambition outpaces compassion, wherever tradition is held sacred above life itself. The Habsburgs remind us that no family, no empire, no nation is immune to collapse when it worships power above all else. In the end, their crowns turn to rust, their bloodlines to dust. And what endures is a haunting truth, that nature cannot be commanded, that even kings and queens are subject to its laws. The Habsburgs tried to cheat it, binding themselves tighter and tighter in a web of their own making, but the web strangled them, and all their titles, their wars, their glory could not undo the choices of their ancestors. So when you hear the name Habsburg, remember, are not just the empire they built, but the empire they destroyed within themselves. For theirs is the most chilling dynasty ever recorded, a family who sat on thrones of gold, yet were undone by the very blood that made them royal. Blood gave them power, but blood also took it away.